and a lot of people that I've listened to or read online really balk at the violence of the show. And while it is a violent show, historically speaking, the actual event, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, was likely way more violent. Probably would have been even worse to actually depict the real violence that occurred. So the truth, in this case, is even stranger and more violent than the fiction that is portrayed in the show.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. I'm Chip, a historian here at Oregon California Trails Association, and with me today is Travis Boley, the association's manager. Some of you might recognize him from some other films and videos we have here on the channel. Today, we are here to discuss and react to the show American Primeval.
There's war brewing in this territory.
The show American Primeval covers the beginning of the Utah Wars in the late 1850s. Travis and I are here to react and respond to the first two episodes of the show. Now, it starts off in the opening scene of the first episode. We have Betty Gilpin's character in St. Joseph, Missouri. And I think that's where one of our first things that took us out of the moment as historians with this era was seeing St. Joe portrayed as it looked like a town on the edge of Death Valley almost. And did the trains even go to St. Joe in 1857?
They did. The Hannibal-St. Joseph Railroad was in St. Joseph by 1849. It was also the end point for the railroad until the Transcontinental Railroad was built and completed in 1869. So for those of you who have never been to Missouri, who've never been to St. Joseph, it looks nothing like that show. By 1857, when this show begins, St. Joseph's a town of a few thousand people. It's 8 years into the gold rush. 1849 was the most popular jumping off point heading to the west. So St. Joseph was a fairly well developed town. What you see in the show is a couple of ramshackle buildings, a small depot that says St. Joseph on it. It looks like they're still building the railroad west, probably an homage to the Transcontinental Railroad, but that was the end point. Just a few blocks from the Missouri River is where the train station was located, and that was the end point of the American Railroad.
In the show, one of the characters says it only took them, at this point, so it's 1857, so the trail's been going for 25 years at this point, give or take. But it said it only took them 5 weeks to get from St. Joe to Fort Bridger. At that time, because at one point it would have taken 5 months to do that journey.
It absolutely would have taken them quite a bit more time. I mean, if you were on horseback riding hard every day, you probably could have, but as you can see, when they jump off from St. Joe and they've hired a guide and they have a wagon, it's generally, most people are leaving that area early to mid-May. They're getting to central Wyoming by around the 4th of July. There's a place called Independence Rock, generally speaking, around the 4th of July. And then Fort Bridger's still a couple weeks past that. So we're talking, at best, maybe late July, early August, if you left in early to mid-May, that you're getting to that area, unless you're really...
Because most people aren't riding on horse, they're walking.
They're walking, and you're averaging maybe 20 miles a day, 25 on a good day, so you know, do the math. But before I get into too many criticisms, I just want to say that I did enjoy what I've seen so far. I've seen the first 3 episodes. Anytime you can bring the American West to life, even a fictionalized account, and get it in the minds of the American public, and to continue to popularize 19th century American Western history, that provides an opening for historians to come in and talk about what they got right. They get plenty right. What they got wrong, they got plenty wrong.
We're not here to just harp on it and be like, oh, this is so bad. No, it's good that it's getting people excited about history, about trail history, about the things that we do. It is still a positive thing, getting people excited about history, getting people involved, getting them more interested. On that note, please remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment below of what you believe is the worst historically accurate film of your show of your choice. We won't get into Braveheart.
This was the hardest thing I've ever filmed.
I've read many of the quotes from the director, Peter Berg, and why he took the license that he took. Hollywood, you know, they're kind of notorious for doing that. I don't think anybody goes to watch a movie or a series that's Hollywood and expect a documentary that's going to be 100% accurate. It's a historic fiction. There's going to be a lot of quibbles with the characters of Brigham Young and JimBridger really loom large in this. Some of the American Indian characters who, honestly, I feel were depicted pretty decently well in terms of the culture, the dress, the language. I will say that, to my knowledge, the Paiute and the Shoshone didn't really intermix. They lived in distinct, different geographic areas of the continent. So that's a little bit wrong. But we can get into all of that as we continue this discussion.
Again, they've done a good job in this show of showing native cultures, not just like this monolithic, you know, Indian culture.
Truth be known, most interactions between immigrants heading west and the peoples who already lived there were peaceful. Most tribes were helpful. Most tribes had lots of experience with, especially the earlier French fur trappers, the British fur trappers, even the American fur trappers. JimBridger was one of those. He had great relations with most of the tribes. Not always. I mean, one of his daughters was captured by the Cayuse at the Whitman Massacre site, and she later died. So it wasn't always sunshine and rainbows, but for the most part, most interactions were positive.
So that's the good. On to the, well, we'll just start with some of the major inaccuracies. Smokeless gunpowder was not invented until 1884, I believe, 1887. Around the same time as the first automobile, put it that way. 2 or 3 shots off at that time, you wouldn't be able to see much in front of you. You could hardly see your hand in front of your face. That was the first thing that pulled me out, but that usually pulls me out of most Westerns that take place before, you know, the late 1880s.
The Mormon soldiers are depicted wearing black dusters. It looks very much like a scene from Tombstone. The duster hadn't been invented yet in 1857, and the first dusters that came shortly after that looked nothing like that. What they're wearing is probably more of an 1880s style of dress. So does it really matter? Probably not, but I know some real finicky historians who like to really get down into the minutia, and that's definitely a minutia type of thing, is what they're wearing, what they're shooting, aren't exactly period correct. The most egregious errors, if you will. Number one, by the time the show is depicting Fort Bridger 1857, Fort Bridger no longer existed. Fort Bridger had been sold to Brigham Young and the Mormons, and as the U.S. Army's marching west in 1857 to hopefully put what they felt the Mormons back in their place, Brigham Young had it burned. He wanted to slow the Army down. The Army did wind up building a temporary camp there called Camp Scott at that place where they did winter. I couldn't imagine the brutality of a Wyoming winter in a makeshift camp, but there they were. The other really, I think, gross inaccuracy stems from, and it took me a while to even figure out what it was they were portraying, but I believe they were portraying, and from what I've read, they absolutely were trying to portray the Mountain Meadows Massacre. From the geography of the show, you would almost imagine that the Mountain Meadows Massacre is happening within a few miles, or at least maybe a day's ride of Fort Bridger. Fort Bridger, in case you don't know, is in the extreme southwest corner of Wyoming, and the Mountain Meadows Massacre site is in the extreme southwest corner of Utah. You know, many, many hundreds of miles away from where this purported to occur. The show also depicts the battle itself taking place in a mere minutes. It's actually a 4-day siege. I really wish they had taken the time to develop the characters a bit more who were in the wagon train that were ultimately massacred. They were a group of trail immigrants from Arkansas who were kind of taking a roundabout way to get to Southern California. They had left the main branch of the California Trail in Salt Lake City and headed south along what we call the Mormon Wagon Road. The siege began on September 7th, largely as an attempt to take the cattle. They had a large number of cattle with them. By September 11th, John D. Lee, one of the Mormon leaders at the site, had convinced this group from Arkansas to surrender, that, you know, they were saying the Paiutes are the ones attacking you, we're here to help you. So they surrender, they come out, and they're summarily executed, pretty much right on the spot. Those who survived were then shot in the head. The only people that survived were a number of children, largely under the age of 6. They pretty much killed everybody else, including a large number of children between the ages of 6 and 18.
The level of violence, American Primeval, is probably tame to the actual violence that happened.
The other thing that didn't happen, and we know this from the forensic archaeology that's taken place at Mountain Meadows Massacre, there was no evidence of scalping at the Mountain Meadows Massacre site. What we do know now, historians have pieced this together over time, is that it appears John D. Lee and some of his followers sort of acted on their own. Brigham Young doesn't appear to have known what happened. In fact, whenever John D. Lee comes back north to report to Brigham Young, he basically lies and says, the Paiute committed this on their own, no white men were involved, and all we did was bury the bodies. Eventually the truth does come out. 9 men were eventually charged with this crime, and John D. Lee was actually executed for his role in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I understand that from reading Peter Berg's comments that this was just a jumping off point for him, but I think it really confuses a moment in American history that up until that point was the most violent act, kind of an American on American violence up to that point.
Before the Civil War.
Excluding some wars.
It was people of the Nauvoo Legion working with essentially mercenaries from the Paiute, for lack of a better term.
There were a few Paiute involved. They were promised cattle. This is another thing that the show gets wrong when the Paiute say, well, we were promised cattle and women. Well, they weren't really promised women.
Just cattle.
They were promised cattle. And if you know anything about the geography of southern Utah, it's a hard scrabble place to make a living, especially if you're hunters and gatherers. So some fresh meat would always be welcome.
Now, if they'd been camped there for 4 days, would they have circled the wagons? That's not something they typically did on the trail, though, because they're...
Sometimes they did, especially on the Santa Fe Trail, because a lot of times you were driving large numbers of livestock, and so you would. Meadows Massacre, they did actually circle the wagons there.
Okay.
So how that exactly played out, probably unknown. There was no photographer on site taking pictures. There were some pretty gruesome drawings that appeared in Harper's Weekly later. Sketch artists had gone out and sketched the remains of the people that were just strewn about the ground.
Yeah, I mean, we have a whole section of our library dedicated to the Meadows Massacre, so.
It's a really well-covered topic, and a lot of people take a lot of different approaches to it. A lot of historians have openly questioned how much did Brigham Young know, how much did he, cause this to happen? Did he create conditions that were ripe for this to happen? Probably. You got to remember, they had been driven out of everywhere they had attempted to be. They left Ohio, they come here to Jackson County, Missouri, they're driven out of here, they go to northern Missouri, they're ruthlessly attacked via the Mormon extermination order, they go to Nauvoo, Illinois, Joseph Smith is killed there, they're forced to flee in the dead of winter, they make their way halfway across the continent, they're set up in the Salt Lake Valley. Yeah, I would imagine that would make you a little, trigger happy.
A little angry.
And certainly paranoid that people are coming for you. And on top of that, it's 1857, and Buchanan is sending the U.S. Army out to Utah. And Brigham Young was deathly afraid of the Army. He was holed up in Salt Lake City. When the Army did get to Salt Lake City, he actually fled to Provo, where he had a kind of a walled compound and hid out there for a while. So it's just another one of those quirks that aren't quite depicted accurately.
But Bridger at that time as well would in his second marriage, he'd already had...
He would have been in his third marriage.
He would have been in his third marriage. He'd already had at least one daughter, if not two by that time, because Virginia was born in 1849.
He would have had probably 3 daughters and maybe a son by then. Important thing to note is JimBridger's really good relations with the Shoshone. In fact, he was married to the daughter of, at the time, the Chief Washakie, who's a really, really well-known chief during that era. So she's not depicted at the fort. None of his children are depicted at the fort. I don't know if there was an oversight or just artistic license, but that's kind of a glaring omission.
They showed some children at the fort.
Because JimBridger was actually really close to his children. In fact, late in life when he was losing his eyesight, one of his children basically took care of him in his last years.
Well, on that note, join us next time as we review another JimBridger film, The Revenant. Well, no, because JimBridger is portrayed as a teenager in that one, because he was part of that first expedition in 1821.
Yeah, he was
west.
One of Ashley's 100. I think it was actually 1822.
Yeah, we were still 11 years before the Transcontinental Railroad, and even that. And even after the Transcontinental Road, people were still taking covered wagons out west for another few decades.
Yeah, we've got depictions of covered wagons in 1890s, even early 1900s, of people still going west in covered wagons.
I mean, the trains didn't go up to Seattle area until the late 1890s.